Okay, are we ready to roll? Lisa, are you ready for me to kick things off? Hi, Heather.
We are ready, Susan.
I can't see anybody. Okay, let's get going. I'm Susan Young. Welcome to this noon session of Session 7 of the Arkansas Historical Association's annual conference. My name is Susan Young. My background, for 27 years, was the outreach coordinator at the Shiloh Museum of Ozark History. I recently retired from that great gig and am keeping my foot in the local history pond by serving on the board of directors at Historic Cane Hill. And I'm really glad to be here with y'all today. Have a couple of announcements, a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to hold question and answer till the end of this, till all the presenters have done their session. But you can feel free to type in a question as we go along, either in the chat or in the Q&A feature. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Arkansas Historical Association's YouTube channel in the near future. And at the conclusion of this session, a short survey will pop up on your screen, and we'd appreciate it if before you bug out, you'll take just a few seconds to fill out that survey. All right, I think that's all for housekeeping. I'll introduce our speakers one at a time. So we'll start off with Venessa Arthur, who is the adjunct instructor of history at Northwest Arkansas Community College. She volunteers with the First Generation Mentor Program at NWAC, that's what we call it up here, NWAC, and participates as a judge for National History Day. Ms. Arthur is currently researching the life of George Shorty Crump, the son of Marshal George Crump, who was assassinated in 1927 in St. Joe, Arkansas, and happens to be her third cousin. Ms. Arthur is here with us today to present Adolphine Fletcher Terry, leading advocate for change in Arkansas. So Venessa, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susan, and hello, everyone. I'm going to get started. Bring up my screen. Get to the beginning, that way it'll bring it up correctly. Here we go. All right. And so that I'm not distracting little box, I'm gonna stop my video. That way you can still hear me, but see the pictures. So, as Susan said, I'm going to be talking about Adolphine Fletcher Terry, who was a leading advocate for change in Arkansas. And before I get into the amazing work that she did for Arkansas, especially for women and children, I'm going to share a little bit about her background and who she was. So she was born November 3rd of 1882 to John Gold Fletcher and Adolphine Krause Fletcher in Little Rock, Arkansas. She was the oldest of 3 children. She would graduate high school in Little Rock in 1898, and then she would become the second Arkansas student to ever enroll at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York. She would credit her education on the East Coast and interactions with classmates from outside the South, particularly with Lucy Burns, who would become instrumental in the passage of suffrage nationally, for challenging her thinking about race. After she graduated college, she of course came back to Arkansas to live, and then would eventually marry a Little Rock attorney and eventual congressman, David Dixon Terry, on July 7th of 1910, after a 4-year engagement. She considered David's younger half-sister, Mary Louise, their first child, after the girl came to live with the Terrys after David's mother's untimely death. Of course, her and David would go on to have 4 children of their own between 1911 and 1922. There was David Jr., who was born first, Mary, Sarah, who would go by Sally, and William, who went by Bill. Now, Mary, their second child, was born with osteogenesis imperfecta, a condition that allows the bones to easily break, and this would result in trips across the country for treatment for Mary. Now, on one such trip to Boston in 1928, Mary would meet and befriend an orphan named Joseph, whom the Terrys would eventually adopt and bring back to Arkansas as one of their children. So that's just a little brief look at who she was. Now let's look at some of the amazing social work and activist work that she did for Arkansas. First and foremost was suffragist. She would become more involved in the women's suffrage movement when her sister Mary Fletcher would help found the Women's Political Equality League in February of 1911. The league would later become known as the Arkansas Women's Suffrage Association and Equal Suffrage State Central Committee. They would meet twice a month and sponsored public educational programs. She would write in her manuscript, and I quote, "Mary had been elected the first president of the group because she didn't have a husband who would object. Dave would not have objected to my activity, and I did once march and a parade in the downtown area, but I was not taking on any new responsibilities at the time," end quote. She also would support the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the NAWSA, and the National Women's Party, the NWP. In 1916, she presided over NWP President Alice Paul's meeting at Marion Hotel in Little Rock, and she remained a member of the NWP's National Advisory Committee until 1920. Now, the WPEL first approached the Arkansas legislature about women's right to vote in 1911. The amendment would pass in the Senate, but failed to pass the House. The group would try again in 1913, 1915, and 1917, when women finally won the right to vote in a primary election in Arkansas. So the statewide primary elections were held in May 1918, and more than 40,000 Arkansan women would turn out to vote. Ms. Terry would write in her manuscript, "To me, the vote represents more than just saying how a person feels about an issue of a candidate. It represents human dignity and the fact that a citizen can express his or her opinion on any subject without fear of reprisal. That, I think, is what real human dignity consists of." I couldn't agree more. Now, suffragist work, that was not the only area that she would become involved in. She also would take part in the Young Women's Christian Association. When shortly after World War I ended, she served on an advisory committee that helped establish an African American branch of the Young Women's Christian Association, the YWCA. The project had a lot of significance for her in that she was willing to go against accepted societal norms to help children in need, especially African American children, something that did not happen in the 1920s in the South. She saw her work with the YMCA as a way of helping African Americans establish an institution equal to that available to white women. And according to historian Stephanie Bayless, Terry learned that African Americans were intelligent and capable of reaching their goal. Now, another area that she was involved in was, of course, Arkansas education. The first thing she did with regards with that was in March of 1922, she spoke out for school tax in the local paper and was quoted in that paper saying, "With Arkansas standing next to the last state in the union in educational matters, it is incredible that anyone should consider letting our schools close or that there should be any quibbling over raising more money for the schools. And an enlightened and educated citizen is the hope of the future of the state." And she would work hard to ensure education for all children without regard to their race or background. Another area of education that she worked in, and you can see a picture of one of the groups, of course, is the School Improvement Association, which she helped found, and it was a precursor to the Parent Teacher Association in Arkansas. In 1920, she even helped form the Federation of College Women in Little Rock with a group of college-educated women of various universities. Now, the aim of the club was to ensure women, whether they finished college or not, stayed in contact with academic interest. She would serve as the first president for a very short time, and it would eventually become the Little Rock branch of the American Association of University Women. But I think the biggest area of Arkansas education that Miss Terry had a part in was, of course, the Women's Emergency Committee. In the fall of 1957, as I'm sure many of us know, she learned that Governor Orville Faubus had used troops to prevent Black students from attending Central High School during the Little Rock desegregation crisis, and that a white mob had terrorized the students. And she would write down, "For days I walked about unable to concentrate on anything except the fact that we had been disgraced by a group of poor whites and a portion of the lunatic fringe. Where had the better class been while this was being concocted? Shame on us." So Miss Terry and two friends, Vivian Brewer of Pulaski County and Velma Powell of Little Rock, would form the Women's Emergency Committee after a ballot measure to close Little Rock's high schools as a means of avoiding desegregation passed in 1958. They would become the first organized group of white moderates to oppose the governor and demand the reopening of the city's 4 public high schools. Of course, in the months following its formation, the WEC worked to persuade the public to reopen the schools. And in May of 1959, the WEC, Black voters, and a group called Stop This Outrageous Purge would campaign successfully to recall 3 school board members who were segregationists. And they would eventually help reopen the schools in 1959. Now, besides education, she also worked in forming public libraries in Arkansas. And that was, according to her, one of her greatest accomplishments in the social activist world. During her husband's time in Washington, D.C., she stayed in Little Rock to raise their children and headed an American Legion Auxiliary Committee. And the library project would come to her because of her work with the Committee of Americanism of the American Legion Auxiliary. The committee helped secure federal funds to pay the salaries of librarians in Arkansas. As part of the arrangement, Terry, along with other members of the committee, would collect books and found space to open free libraries throughout Arkansas. And they also convinced the Arkansas legislation to create a state library program. She worked for 40 years as a trustee for the Little Rock Public City Library, and she even helped African Americans gain entrance into the libraries in the 1950s. Another area that she worked in was Arkansas juvenile courts, and she would help develop the Arkansas juvenile court system in Pulaski County, which was modeled after the first one that opened in Illinois in 1899. It operated under the assumption that children should be treated differently than adults when dealing with criminal activity. Of course, Miss Terry was a natural choice to lead a program like this, with her main social platform focusing on the welfare of children. And then another area that she worked in, of course, was the Little Rock Housing Authority. And during the 1930s, she fought hard to combat slum housing that arose during the Great Depression. Miss Terry, along with others, formed the Little Rock Housing Authority that had worked together to secure funds under the 1937 Housing Authority Act. She even formed a group of women to speak on radio shows and in front of civic groups about the need for low-rent housing and slum housing clearance. For Miss Terry, the Little Rock Housing Authority allowed her to continue her social work with the women and children of Arkansas. And of course, that work she began in the 1930s can still be seen today with the continued work at the Little Rock Housing Authority and the work they do with low-income families. And then, of course, lastly, another area that meant a lot to her, of course, was children's health. And that was because of one of her children, of course, I mentioned her, Mary. Throughout her work in the 1920s and 30s, she also strived to care for her children, which was the main reason for the work she did to help other women and children in Arkansas. As I mentioned, Mary was born with a crippling bone disease, osteogenesis imperfecta, that left her crippled for life. She would write of her experience for caring for Mary in her only book published, Courage, in 1938. She wrote in this book about her struggle with taking care of Mary and having to come to grips, I guess you could say, with what she expected for Mary and motherhood in general, and to reality of raising a child like Mary. Now, because of Mary's physical disabilities, Terry would focus on her mental health instead. Took her to museums and concerts and lectures and movies and on shopping trips. Unfortunately, when Mary turned 8, her condition worsened and doctors felt she'd not live past 15. And for Mary, that opened her eyes, and she decided to help her daughter live a very fulfilled life, no matter how long she had left to live. Well, Mary surprised everybody, and she would live a long and fulfilling life, including graduating from college and working in the field of psychology. Of course, Terry stated that caring for Mary led to a spiritual awakening and led to a sense of real achievement and peace. And that experience would lead her to form other organizations like the Pulaski County Tuberculosis Association and the Community Chest, which was the forerunner for the United Way. So, in conclusion, because I know my time is running out, Miss Terry became a very prominent figure for social activism for children and women in Arkansas. Her accomplishments could be seen in her organization or her help in organizing various groups throughout Arkansas. I just mentioned some of them. From the School Improvement Association, which I said was a precursor to the modern Parent-Teacher Association, the College Club, which is the precursor to the Little Rock branch of the American Association of the University Women, the first Pulaski County Juvenile Court, the Girls Industrial School in Saline County, the Community Chest, which I just said was a precursor to the United Way, the Little Rock Housing Authority, the College Station Head Start Program and Community Center, the Little Rock Women's City Club, the Arkansas State Festival of the Arts, the Pulaski County Tuberculosis Association, and the Women's Emergency Committee to open our schools. She also, of course, sat on various boards, including one of the most important, the Pulaski County Library. Many of these programs we are all still benefiting from today and will continue to do so for many years to come, thanks to her. All right, and I will turn it back over to Susan.
To me. Thank you. Thank you, Venessa. All right, next we have Geoffrey Stark, who is a graduate of the University of Arkansas's Department of History. He was formerly the Research Services Coordinator of Special Collections at Mullins Library in Fayetteville. And let me just say that when Geoffrey left that post, there was a collective wail from those of us up here in Northwest Arkansas who relied on his skills in helping us access those wonderful collections. But I'm glad that you're where you are now, Geoffrey, because I know that you're happy. He is now working as the digital archivist at the Historical Research Center at the UAMS Library in Little Rock. Mr. Stark is here to share with us his presentation, Lidia Gertrudis Sogandares, a pioneer for women in medicine. Take it away, Geoffrey.
Okay. Are y'all seeing that? Okay. Hi, I'm Geoffrey Stark, and I am the digital archivist at the UAMS Historical Research Center. And one of my projects is the Arkansas Women of Color in Medicine. Today, I will be talking about one of the people of interest in my project, as well
Geoffrey,
as. Oh, yeah.
Excuse me. Can you put it on? You've got it on the back end of your presentation. Can you do it on slideshow? Just so we can see it in its full glory.
Is it there now?
No, I'm still seeing your slide sorter, but I don't let me interrupt you any further, that is.
Okay. Is that it? Nope. Sorry, I'll just go ahead and
go ahead.
going.
I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
Anyhow, I heard about other trailblazers that had come through UAMS. I had heard about Edith Irby Jones and Joycelyn Elders, but I had never heard of Lidia Sogandares before. She graduated from the medical school in 1934 and was to become the first female doctor in Panama. In a 1951 interview with a journalist writing for Panama America, Lidia Sogandares commented that she had always harbored a desire to be a doctor, and she had been often dissuaded from pursuing that dream. That due to her sex, she could not seriously pursue a career in medicine, and that she would soon get bored. Well, that was not the case. It was uncommon in the early 20th century for a woman in Panama to seek to enter a profession that was dominated by men. However, Lidia Sogandares grew up when it was a very early time when the suffrage movement was just beginning in Panama. While she was competing for the equivalent of high school, women's suffrage and rights movement in Panama had only just begun, and the country itself was undergoing a great deal of political change as it transitioned into a republic. I would like to first provide you a little background about Lidia Sogandares' family and her education, which would help explain how she arrived in Arkansas. Lidia Sogandares' grandfather was a gentleman named Don Anastasio Sogandares. He had made his fortune as a ship captain and established his family on the island of Tobago near Trinidad. Lidia was born there in 1908 to a large family. She had 4 brothers and a little sister. Her earliest education began in a very modest town on the island. And as she grew older, her father, Don Manuel Sogandares, relocated his family to Panama City, where he went to work for the National Navigation Company. This was around 1920. This family move had a big impact on Lidia's development because in 1924, she managed to be enrolled in the National Institute to complete her education. It was not easy for women to be admitted into a college, but because Lidia Sogandares had excelled in her primary studies, she managed to get in. She soon exhibited a proficiency in the sciences and excelled in those studies. In 1926, she graduated with a bachelor's in science and letters at the top of her class. This created for her some celebrity because it was regarded as a great step for women that she had graduated with such honors. A person who was very important in helping Lidia Sogandares in reaching her educational goals and eventually coming to Arkansas was Esther Nera de Calvino. She was a prominent educator, feminist, and women's rights advocate. At the time that Lidia Sogandares first contacted her, she was teaching at the Normal College in Panama City and very well connected with the Pan American Union. The Pan American Union was an organization that was essentially a defensive coalition that included governments throughout the Americas. It was centered in Washington, D.C., and was engaged in a lot of cultural and student exchange, and it would play a pretty big role in furthering Lidia Sogandares' education. Esther Nera de Calvo tells a story of their first meeting as something of a coincidence. One morning in 1927, she says that she opened a letter from Dr. Leo Rowe, who was the director of the Pan American Union. Dr. Rowe had written her in regard to a new scholarship opportunity that the organization was offering for a Panamanian woman to study at the College of St. Teresa in Winona, Minnesota. As she was thinking this over, her phone rang, and it was Lidia Sogandares who had called her to ask if she would be her mentor. Later, when they met, Lidia confided that she wanted to pursue a medical degree. Esther Nera de Calvo knew that Lidia was the student who had graduated with honors from the National Institute and thought it was a very happy coincidence that she called at that specific moment because she was the perfect candidate for that scholarship. With her help and with the help of the Pan American Union, Lidia Sogandares was soon on her way to Minnesota to begin her pre-med studies at a prestigious institution run by the Franciscan Order. In a letter dated June 28, 1930, Sister Alois Malloy recalled Lidia Sogandares as a very unusual young woman. She has excellent ability. She works hard and devotes all her energy and enthusiasm to whatever she undertakes. When she came to the St. Teresa's, she was handicapped by the fact that she was studying a language foreign to her own, but with little difficulty, she overcame this obstacle and has succeeded very well in her work. By 1928, Lidia Sogandares thrived in Minnesota. Her personality was such that she was very outgoing. Sister Malloy noted that she had contributed to the life of the campus by all of her extra participation in extracurricular activities. She was elected president of the International Student Club, and she had also joined the Honor Society. Lidia Sogandares' success at the College of St. Teresa prepared her for furthering her medical education when she was to come to Arkansas. Of all the potential medical schools throughout the country, the selection of the University of Arkansas School of Medicine at first glance would seem somewhat strange. And yet, in the various commemorations of Dr. Sogandares' life, the university is highly praised as have been very formulative of her medical career. Dr. David Baird, in his history, Medical Education in Arkansas, paints a picture of the university as being mirrored in troubles in the late 20s and early 30s. Some of the inherent problems were the poor facilities and the lack of equipment that the medical students were required to use. And many of the conditions were evident when Lidia Sogandares was a student here. Here are just a few examples. The preclinical departments in the old State House were in a terrible shape. The classrooms and laboratories were too dark for scientific work. The plumbing was very poor throughout the building, and the rooms were inadequately heated. There was a cadaver that the students used for their education, and it was kept in the cellar in a tank. And to fish it out, they had to go and get a pole with a hook to bring it into the classrooms, which was a terrible experience for pretty much everybody. Where it was common for medical schools to have 100 to 200 beds. The old State House only had 50 at that time. The ratio of students to faculty was regarded as far too large, and some of the auditors insisted that they hire more experienced professors. No less than 3 investigative audits were appalled at the conditions at the school, and had actually wanted the university to go on probation. And yet there were also some trends that spoke favorably for seeking admission in the University of Arkansas School of Medicine. For the representatives of the Pan American Union, it was in everyone's best interest that Lidia Sogandares attend a program that would see her goals realized. The medical school had maintained its status as an A institution and was very near to being accredited. So it was always on the cusp of being included with the top-notch medical education programs across the country. The graduates at the program had a lot of success transitioning into postgraduate careers. In 1931, when taking the state board licensing examinations, Arkansas's failure rate was 2.9%, which is far below the national average of 6.9%. Women had already been admitted to the medical school. Annie Skopek was the first female graduate from the medical school in 1901. So at the time Lidia Sogandares was applying, even though she would be the first Latino woman to enter the university, her sex would not be a barrier to her. Another factor that may have swayed her advisors was that the medical school had a reputation for hiring foreign physicians as faculty. This was largely due to the influence of Frank Vincenhaler. Dean Vincenhaler was regarded as a respectable, gentlemanly figure. He was educated in Austria and London. During World War I, he was the commander of a battlefield hospital in Vichy, France. He seems to have had a cosmopolitan worldview, and that showed in how he had administrated the school. And seen in this different light, the willingness to add European doctors to the staff may well have impressed the officials from the Pan American Union that the University of Arkansas Medical School would be the right environment for Lidia Sogandares' education. On April 24th, 1930, Dean Vincenhaler received a letter from the Consul General of Panama, Enoch Adamus V, providing reference for Lidia Sogandares' application. In it, he wrote, "I wish to recommend Miss Lidia Sogandares in the name of my government. Miss Sogandares has always been a distinguished student engaged in all kinds of activities in school. I would also further like to acquaint you with the fact that she is the only Panamanian girl who has ever considered to study medicine, hoping that you give Miss Sogandares the opportunity that she has been waiting for." Enoch Adams's references underlines a real intent of the Pan American Union to see Lidia succeed in her goal of becoming the first Panamanian female doctor. The organization remained a prominent force throughout this period in her life and was a real asset to her education. Lidia Sogandares arrived at the University of Arkansas Medical School in 1930 among some notoriety. The school had a record enrollment in that year of 185 students and 68 faculty. And the Arkansas Gazette ran stories with 2 successive years that even a girl all the way from Panama City would be attending the medical school. There would be 2 other young women in Lydia's freshman class for that fall semester. She attended the medical school for 4 years, earning a bachelor's in 1932 and then graduating with her MD in the field of obstetrics. Obstetrics is a field of study focused on pregnancy and childbirth, and it's most often combined with gynecology. And a decision to combine those 2 fields was something that Lidia Sogandares was eventually to pursue. We are told by her friend and advisor, Esther Nera de Calvo, that during the 8 years that Lidia Sogandares spent in the U.S., 4 of them in Arkansas, she occasionally had vacation time to return to Panama. But instead of vacationing, she usually chose to volunteer at a medical center. She volunteered at the Panamanian Red Cross, the Panama Hospital, and the St. Thomas Hospital, where she was later to return. Most noticeably, she volunteered for a Dr. Herbert C. Clark at the Gorgas Memorial Laboratory. Dr. Clark was a pathologist who studied tropical medicines and diseases. Lidia Sogandares impressed him with her aptitude to biomedical research, and he offered guidance on where she should complete her residency upon graduating from the University of Arkansas. Residency is where doctors, after they've earned their degree, they can go and specialize in a particular field. He commended her to the Women's Hospital in Philadelphia, where she was to complete her education in 1935. While she was there, she attended doctors in surgery as head assistant. And it is there that Dr. Sogandares decided to specialize in both obstetrics and gynecology. When Dr. Sogandares returned to Panama in 1936, she was the first woman from Panama to receive her doctorate in medicine, and also the first woman in Central America. She spent 2 years teaching at the Normal College in Panama City. Then in the 1930s, an opportunity arrived that changed her course. She was able to get an internship at the St. Thomas Hospital, where she had previously been a volunteer. At St. Thomas, in a relatively short time, she would go through being an intern to a resident to a deputy chief and then to chief of obstetrics and gynecology. Besides her own tenacity, there were some factors that played into her career in Panama in the 40s and 50s. There was a sharp uptick in demographics. In Panama at that time, there was no national program established for sex education, and there wasn't private clinics to teach the use of contraceptives. What women and men knew were largely taught at home or on the street. And it was a culture where sexual matters were taboo and taught from ignorance. A professional with Dr. Sogandares' education, and by the 1940s, actual medical experience, was in high demand. And she certainly had her work cut out for her because the maternity ward of the St. Thomas Hospital had insufficient facilities, resources, and low staff to meet with the excess of patients that they would annually receive. In a way, her education in Arkansas may well have prepared her to meet that environmental difficulty. On average, 3 doctors attended more than 400 deliveries per year at that hospital. And Esther Nero del Calvo would note that maintaining the work of that maternity ward would be one of the greatest challenges of her life up until the time that she retired in 1969. Shortly after she began her medical duties, St. Thomas in 1937, at St. Thomas in 1937, Lidia Sogandares visited the University of Arkansas a final time. By that time, Senator Joe T. Robinson had provided Dean Vincent Haler with the funding to build a new medical school. Dr. Sogandares told the Arkansas Gazette that she was delighted with the new building, which had been completed after she had left Little Rock. She was lauded in the article as Dr. Lidia Sogandares' only woman doctor in Panama. At the time of her death in October of 1971, Dr. Sogandares was co-founder and first female member of the Panamanian Academy of Medicine and Surgery. She was co-founder and first president of the Panamanian Society of Obstetrics and Gynecology, a member of the Pan American Alliance of Medical Women, the Isthmian Medical Association of the Canal Zone, and the Women Medical Association. And perhaps most of all, she was honored for the support that she offered to a generation of women physicians who followed her example and entered into the field of medicine. There is a painting that is hanging up in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. It shows 3 schools that were instrumental in her medical career: the College of St. Teresa, the University of Arkansas School of Medicine, and the St. Thomas Hospital. Arkansas had managed to play a small but impactful life in her life journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Right, our final presenter is Brian Irby. He is archival assistant at the Arkansas Archives, where he has been on staff since 2008. He holds a master's degree in history from the University of Central Arkansas, and in a few weeks he will be completing his master's in library science from the University of North Texas. Congratulations, Brian. And Mr. Irby, I should say, lives in North Little Rock, and he is here with us for the final presentation of this session to discuss a Crusader in decline, the final years of Carrie A. Nation. Take it away, Brian.
Okay, let's see here if I can do this correctly. You all see my screen? Okay. Well, I wish I could be there in person with everyone, but at least I don't have to worry about Will Smith slapping me. So I guess that's a plus. We've all seen stories about Carrie Nation. Perhaps when you saw the title for this talk, you had the image of a hatchet-wielding zealot smashing her way through the bar rooms across the country. Well, that's what made Carrie Nation famous. And by her account, she'd been arrested 33 times, been beaten, bruised, kicked, had bones broken, and the scars on her face to prove her devotion to the cause. But this is not the Carrie A. Nation I wish to describe. I titled this talk "A Crusader in Decline" because I believe the press from the time he noted that she was in decline, both in actions and mental capacity. But after studying this a bit closer, I've concluded that she was not in decline. When she moved to Eureka Springs, she only seemed to have gone soft. She no longer attacked saloons with her hatchet, but she remained the firebrand that everyone knew. She had merely shifted her focus from destroying bar rooms to educating the public about alcohol in a more civil manner and protecting those she saw as the most vulnerable in society. She put her hatchet away, but her tongue remained just as sharp. Now, by all accounts, Carrie Nation had a less than ideal life. She was born in 1846 in Kentucky. She married young to Charles Gloyd, a Civil War veteran who was an alcoholic and physically abused her. And after her divorce, she married a gentleman, David Nation, who also seemed to have had a fondness for drink. Though she stayed with him, likely because she was able to spend the rest of her life traveling on behalf of the anti-alcohol crusade and was not in the same vicinity as him. Much of her future actions would be propelled by her sense of God's will in her life. She had grown up in the Disciples of Christ movement, a religious movement that developed into the Church of Christ. She seems to have been a dutiful and very pious young woman, given to study the Bible with great care and attention. It also seems that her religious upbringing was not adequate to her. By the 1880s, after moving to Texas, she began attending a Methodist church. She reported in her autobiography that in 1884, she was attending a conference where she felt the Holy Spirit enter into her. She told all her family and friends that from that day forward, All her time would be devoted to God. Her religious fervor began to trouble some people in her social circle. They worried that her religious expressions might have an underlying mental illness. One person said to her that, quote, "Your friends are becoming very uneasy about the state of your mind. You're thinking too much on religious subjects, and they asked me to warn you." Well, she laughed off such concerns, recalling that the Bible said that the world would not be able to comprehend Christians. There was, of course, more than a simple cause for concern. There was a family history of mental illness, after all. Her mother might have had delusions of grandeur, including the belief that she was Queen Victoria. Carrie's brother committed her to a mental hospital in the 1890s, but there's evidence of such stories of Carrie's mother's mental hygiene might have been overblown by Carrie's enemies, who wished to prove that Carrie was suffering from the same types of delusions. After all, her mother did, in fact, die in a hospital in Missouri in 1893. Carrie never brushed off such arguments, likely because of the difficult relationship she had had with her mother. Her mother, she remarked, was often very cold to her. Nevertheless, Carrie recognized the mental health issues of her mother, giving the reason for the problems that she, quote, "went insane because my father lost his property, not because of a hereditary condition." Nevertheless, she soon found an outlet for this religious devotion. After moving to Medicine Lodge, Kansas, she attended a Methodist church there. She soon had a falling out with the church elders, often finding her a very difficult parishioner. For instance, when the church withdrew fellowship from a woman who was being charged for adultery, Nation stood up to defend her, much to the consternation of the church elders. Her advocacy of the woman led the church to withdraw fellowship from Carrie as well, saying that Nation was, quote, "a stumbling block and a disturber of the peace." This would be a pattern that would repeat itself throughout her life in regards to religion. It was in Medicine Lodge that Carrie first began her activities that brought her fame. In 1901, Nation decided that simple lecturing was not quite doing the job she had hoped in regard to alcohol. After a time in prayer, Nation declared that she had had a vision from God, that she would adopt more militant tactics. At first, she began preaching outside of saloons. Then she began haranguing patrons. Before long, she took the hatchet as her favorite tool and began entering the saloons, destroying kegs of beer, whiskey bottles, and furniture. Soon, newspapers across the nation began to cover her militancy, and she entered into legend. It was also about this time that she seemed to change the spelling of her first name from Carrie to Carry. In a symbolic gesture, no doubt, she was now Carrie a Nation, as if carrying the nation on her back was her new role in her life. Her actions, hatchetations, as she termed them, became what people would expect of her, and she found the public found her unsavory, and most temperance groups also found her an embarrassment. Instead, they favored the rise of such groups as the Anti-Saloon League, which sought to change within the law. These groups shunned Nation's theatricality for more common sense actions. One member of the Anti-Saloon League argued, "I don't believe in fanatics. They do not accomplish what common sense does." One method of growing their movement was to work within Protestant churches in order to build a faction. This avenue, of course, was closed to Nation. She was wary of churches, and they felt the same way towards her. In 1904, her lecture tours brought her to Arkansas. When she arrived in Mena, she was greeted at the train station by a growing mob of townspeople, alternately cheering and jeering the hatchet woman. As she traveled the state, she often stopped in front of saloons to lecture bar patrons. During a lecture tour through Arkansas in 1906, she stopped in Little Rock, where she made a point to stand in front of the Hamel Saloon and shake her fist at patrons, shouting, "Get out of there, you're all going to the devil." She demanded that Little Rock's officials shut down the saloons, quote, "and I don't want to find the same conditions when I come back." Then she left for Hot Springs, where she was briefly jailed for assaulting a police officer following a spat with a pole hall owner. She traveled throughout the Midwest lecturing audiences about temperance and encouraging them to take action against the liquor menace. She hoped that these lecture tours would inspire others to take part in her crusade. She carried with her a trunk full of souvenir hatchets that she would sell to her audiences. These earned her a small fortune. After traveling the state on a number of speaking tours, she found Arkansas to her liking. And in 1909, she took a large sum of money she made from selling these souvenir hatchets and chose to buy a farm in Alpena Pass, Arkansas. When farming got dull, she sought another location, Eureka Springs. When she bought the property in Eureka Springs, she told a reporter she did so because the town was known for its, quote, noble women, and that she has decided to cast her lot among them, that she wants to live where she could be in touch with them. She seemed content finally to settle down and raise pigs, chickens, and apples and leave her hatchet-wielding days behind her. This was not the Carrie Nation they expected. She was obviously in decline, the press noted. However, when she arrived, she found one more den of iniquity that must be vanquished. A distillery was operating just a few miles from her new home. It's a regular hellhole, she told the Pine Bluff Daily Graphic. This business must be done away with. I ask the people to cooperate with me to bring such influence to bear on the owners that they will be forced to go out of business. This was not followed by a hatchetation. In fact, there's no evidence that she took much action at all against the distillery. Instead, she quietly settled into her new home. The press again said she was mellowing in her old age. She purchased a building on the outskirts of Eureka Springs on Steel Street. She dubbed the building Hatchet Hall. She opened a school in the building, the National College of Eureka Springs in 1910 to train temperance workers and speakers. Additionally, she rented rooms to women fleeing abusive relationships for $10 a month, well below the $40 a month going rate. She also bought another building just down the street from Hatchet Hall, which would be a rest home for the elderly. Her establishment of these places was very much a reflection of her own escape from her abusive first husband. The press was aghast at such shift of tactics. She's used more of her skills on the lecture circuit than her hatchet. The Pine Bluff Daily Graphic noted her move to Arkansas, quote, she came to North Arkansas to spend her declining years in pure air and healthful climate, free from the contamination of the open saloon. That year took her to the UK, and the press noted not a single hatchet attack. Many papers reported she was retiring from public life. She wasn't retiring, though. She was only changing tactics, having come to the conclusion that her role should be education, not violence. She opened a school in Hatchet Hall, hoping to attract women to take up the mantle of Crusader. It's notable that she did not attack a single saloon in her new hometown. She might have shown a mellowness in her new residence, however. She was not quite finished attracting attention. While she did not go in after the saloons in Eureka Springs, she still had the habit of jerking cigarettes and cigars out of the mouths of men she encountered, including the mayor. This was a habit she had for several years. It doesn't seem to have aroused much trouble in Eureka Springs. She also had one more major hatchet attack in her future, and this one would be the most spectacular of her career. In December 1909, she made her way to Washington, D.C. to lecture on temperance issues. Noticing a saloon in the newly opened Union Station, she felt compelled to take action. She went into the hardware store and purchased 3 hatchets, which she named Faith, Hope, and Charity, and made her way to the saloon. She had smashed a number of whiskey bottles before police were able to subdue her and lead her off to jail. When she was booked at the police station, they asked her what her profession was. She answered, servant of God, to which the officer dutifully recorded in his report, servant as her occupation. She refused to post bail and was put in jail. When she appeared in front of the judge the next day, she told the judge she was going to read from cases from the Supreme Court, at which time she revealed her Bible and began reading passages of it aloud. Arriving back in Eureka Springs, she settled back down to running her school and lecturing against the evils of alcohol. When she was told she could not lecture in the city park, she propped up a wagon in the street and lectured to all in the park. She may not have been attacking saloons, but she was by no means retired. Her time in Eureka Springs was short, however. While at home on January 10th, 1911, Nation suffered a nervous collapse, possibly from the stress of lecturing. Her friends took her to the hospital in Kansas City, Missouri to recuperate. After a short stay in Kansas City, she settled in Leavenworth, Kansas, where she died on June 9th, 1911. Let me close with a quote from her autobiography, The Use and the Need of Life, written in 1908. She concluded with an admittance that her life was at times chaotic. Quote, I can say to humanity that I feel grateful for their many kind of words and deeds, expressions of gratitude for the imperfect way in which I've served you. I can see where I've made grievous mistakes, but they were of the head and not of the heart. Yet exceeding all of this gratitude, I owe to God for using me on behalf of the motherhood to rescue the boy. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Brian. I feel like I want to stand up and say, let's hear it for the women after these three presentations. All right, we've got, and thank you to all the speakers for your adeptness at staying within your time limit. It's hard to do 15 minutes justice, but y'all did do your topic justice in 15 minutes, but you did. Okay, let's get to a couple of questions. Everybody hear me okay? Brian, I can see you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so this question is for Venessa. Venessa, looking back at the photo that you shared of Ms. Terry and Governor Faubus, do you know anything about this photo? They seem to be passing a bill of currency between them. Oh, you're muted. There you go.
I got it. Till that was pointed out to me, I didn't realize it. So I went to see, I found it on the Encyclopedia of Arkansas's website underneath her entry. And all it's, it says it's from the Butler Center. It's from May 4th of 1964, and that's all it says. But when I zoomed in, I'm like, you know what? That really does look like money. So I'm gonna have to do some more research about why it looks like they're passing money.
There's a story there.
There's another story there.
Yeah, great. Another question for you, Venessa. Did Mary live a long life after college?
Actually, yeah, I looked up on Find a Grave really quick, and it says she died. She was born March 28th of 1914, died October 17th of 1974 at age 60. So she did, and she actually was a psychologist at the Arkansas Children's Home and Hospital in Little Rock.
All right, let's see. I'm scrolling down. Okay, thank you, Venessa.
You're welcome.
Let's shift over to Geoffery. Geoffery, did Lidia Sogandares have any children?
She did not. She did have a lot of nieces and nephews. In fact, I heard from one of her nieces who's interested in more information on her.
Well, so that could give you an avenue for some more information.
I hope so. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. All right, and Brian, here's a good one for you. How would Carrie Nation have been taken today?
I think it would have been probably treated as a joke. I mean, that's how the press looked at her 100 years ago. There's a sad moment in the last years of her life. She went to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she was pretty much set up as a carnival show. And I'm afraid that's probably how people would look at her today. I mean, her being that militant often doesn't really change minds. And I think that's probably what she came to the conclusion of herself.
Okay, Geoffery said, just so we know, Geoffery says his video is stopped, so we're not going to get to see his cheerful face, I guess. Brian, let me just share this with you since it's not a direct question, but comment on your topic. Good summing up of Carrie Nation's autumnal years. And I'm glad that you point out that she changed tactics, not direction. The ASL dismissing her tactics is ironic, given the league's fondness for stunts and reliance on pseudoscience. And I did not deliver that statement nearly as effectively as David Ware himself would have. But just so you know. And let's see, from the estimable Michael Dugan, I have my mother's hatchet pin, which she wore in the battle to close saloons in Neosho, Missouri. Wow. Wow. Well, Michael, I know you have followed after your mother's teetotaling ways.
Yeah, I think we have a hatchet at the Arkansas State Archives, one of the original souvenir hatchets as well.
Fabulous. All right, any other last call for questions or comments? Now, do not leave before, wait, here's a comment from, let's see, let me get this comment so y'all can, because I saw it. In 1964, Adolphine and her sister, Mary Fletcher Drennan, deeded the house to the Arkansas Arts Center, now the Arkansas Museum of Fine Arts, and it went on to become the Decorative Arts Museum and the Arkansas Arts Center Terry House Community Gallery. And
That could
Judy,
have been-
that was from Judy Costello, and she said, I wonder if that was the passing of the money.
It may have been. I know there's a big debate going on with that house right now in Little Rock, saying that the terms are not being followed, and I think the family's trying to get it back.
Hmm.
So I'll have
Mhm.
to look into that more.
This story just keeps unfolding as we talk about it, Vanessa. And Michael Dugan, I want you to be sure that you see David Ware's comment that says there's a place in the archives awaiting that pin of your mama's. But I imagine Michael probably still wears that pin on occasion, so he's probably not ready to give it up just yet. Okay, so we'll stop and give you all plenty of time to please do the exit little anonymous survey, help us become better. And on a personal note, I want to thank Dr. Kelly Houston Jones for giving me the opportunity to moderate this wonderful session. And I look forward to seeing y'all again soon, in person, perhaps even. All right. I'll turn it over to the tech gurus, Heather and Lisa, to get us out of here.